Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get you to take your seats, please. And can I just say thank you for coming back for this part of the day. I know it's the hardest one, probably, but we have got two great discussions lined up for you, and that will take us to the end of the day. And our first one is about policing reform under a new government. What are the opportunities and the challenges for the service with a new administration, and what are we likely to expect in the coming months and years? I think we've had an idea of that over the past couple of days, but our speaker is Dr Rick Muir, who's the director of the Police Foundation. That's the UK's independent policing think tank. A little bit about Rick. He's led the foundation since 2015 and oversaw its work on the strategic review of policing in England and Wales. We are delighted he is with us tonight, or this afternoon I should say. So please welcome Dr Rick Muir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I think I was supposed to be on this morning, but I think because the Shadow Home Secretary isn't here, I'm sort of standing in his slot, which is new. I won't try to impersonate the Shadow Home Secretary, given what Andy Cook was just saying about the need for strict impartiality. So I thought what I would talk about is what we can expect under the new administration. And really, we obviously heard a bit about that from Diana Johnson and Yvette Cooper. But I think there's probably a lot of questions out there about what we can expect under the Labour government. And that's partly because in Labour's manifesto, in many ways, they took a fairly minimal approach to setting out what they were going to do. And I think that was partly, obviously, a function of the fact that they were expecting not to have loads and loads of money that they could spend on lots of different things. And so they made various commitments in their manifesto, which I'll talk about a bit in a moment. But that doesn't tell you a great deal, I don't think, about how they will what kind of shape policy will take in relation to policing. And so I'm going to try and read the runes somewhat and sort of draw out of the things that I know and the conversations that I've had to try to pick out some of the things that I think we can expect over the next 4 to 5 years. But before I do that, I thought it would be good just to do a brief history of police reform under various different governments. Some of this you will have personal experience of, some of it may be before your time. Police reform really began in earnest under the Conservatives after 1979 and was part of a wider approach to public service reform undertaken in that period by the Thatcher and Major governments, which in relation to public services has been described as the birth of new public management. And this was the idea that which was popular on the new right at the time, which was that public services are inefficient, they're not accountable enough, they've been captured by vested interests, and we therefore need to introduce lots of measures from the private sector and more sort of private sector style disciplines into the public services. And we saw that with the privatisation of many public utilities. But in relation to policing, attempts to introduce some private sector management practices into the police service. Highly controversial at the time, not all of it went ahead. There was the Posen inquiry and there was another inquiry which I've momentarily forgotten the name of, but both of those are about introducing private sector, particularly private sector performance management techniques into policing. And then under the Labour government between 1997 and 2010, I think you can sort of characterise that approach crudely as money and targets, because that Labour government increased spending on policing and indeed on most public services by quite a significant amount. But in return for that investment, expected policing to achieve various different things. And the way in which they operationalised that was through the setting of lots of targets, which many people in this room may remember, You may remember the policing performance assessment framework and all this sort of stuff, which was about sort of tracking how well policing was doing in relation to various outputs and outcomes. And that was the way in which they tried to manage the system. Now, that the sort of heavier end of that, where there were lots and lots of different targets, lasted up until 2008. And then in 2008, they changed their approach, recognizing that the target culture had gone completely mad, frankly. I mean, there were just too many targets. They introduced a lot of rigidity into the system. Local forces couldn't respond to local people's priorities because they had to follow national targets all the time. There was a concern about it was incredibly demoralizing for police officers to feel that they had to chase targets rather than being driven by the underlying purpose of the service which they were working for. And so for all sorts of reasons, they then shifted in 2008 to a single target, which was the public confidence target. So the single target was to improve public confidence in policing. And then, of course, we had the 2010 election. And then after 2010, you have the coalition government and the later Conservative governments which followed. And I would characterise that period as being about austerity and localism. Almost the exact reverse of what the previous Labour government was doing. The previous Labour government was all about spending more money. This government was about cutting money. This previous Labour government was about central management and control of policing. This government was about localising that and saying actually central government won't be setting targets. They removed the old target regime and they introduced police and crime commissioners, which Mr. Cook was talking about earlier. And the idea was we don't need to set lots of targets from the centre because we'll elect police and crime commissioners and they will hold the police to account locally with their police and crime plans and so on. And that's how essentially performance of policing will be managed. That period has now obviously drawn to a close and we have this new period of a new Labour government. And I leave a question mark in that box because I think it is still unclear exactly what kind of, I don't think you could encapsulate it in sort of 2 words, what kind of approach we're likely to see, because I think it is still emerging. But before I talk about what they've committed to doing and what I think they're going to do, I want to talk a bit about the inheritance that they have been left with, because that obviously shapes the context in which they have to operate. The first thing to say is that crime has fallen. Crime did fall during the period of the last government, according to the crime survey for England and Wales, which I think is the best overall estimate of the volume of crime. Not all crime fell, some crime went up, some crime went down, but the overall volume of crime decreased during that period. It has to be said, it was falling before that. Volume crime has been falling fairly consistently since the mid-1990s. No one believes that. You won't read about it in the newspapers, but it's true. I was on a radio phone-in where I said this, and the presenter said that I was out of my mind in asserting that crime has fallen over the last 20-odd years, but it's true. But it has changed in composition and it's become more complex. So, so the fact that it's fallen doesn't mean there's any less work for you guys. It means that it's fallen, but the types of crime you're now dealing with, and you don't need me to tell you this, are more complex, particularly sexual crime, vastly more complex to investigate than a lot of acquisitive crime. And so that complexity makes the job harder. And of course, we've seen this massive shift into crime, into the online arena, and that's very significant. So a big change in composition and complexity, which poses a challenge for the service. The second thing, which I think is an inheritance, is that the police role as the public service of last resort has been stretched by austerity, and this relates to all of the work that police forces are doing every single day relating to the needs of vulnerable people, mental health crises, missing person incidents, all the safeguarding issues which the police have to deal with, street homelessness. I mean, all of these issues, which I think are directly linked to austerity, because other public services were cut back, and you're getting more of that there was more of that crisis-related, welfare-related demand, which policing had to pick up. That hasn't abated, even with changes to the way in which the police are dealing with mental health incidents, for example, in working with the NHS. That kind of demand is still with us. The criminal justice system is in crisis. This is probably the biggest crisis currently, I think, and people have been talking a bit about this throughout the day. The sheer volume of the backlog of cases trying to get into court, the fact that we have prisons that are full and which we're now having to release people from in order to make space so that when the police are arresting people and when they're being charged and convicted, there's actually somewhere for them to go. All of this is a major significant problem, which is going to require some very brave decisions, not just on early release from prison, which I think is just inevitable because there just aren't the places, you have to let people out, but also around alternatives to custody. There's going to have to be a pursuit of greater use of out-of-court disposals, greater use of diversion programs, more use of community sentences, more electronic tagging. That, I think, is just inevitable because we simply cannot. I mean, even if you build more prisons, I mean, how long does it take to build a prison? A long time. So even if you build more prisons, you're going to have to take some difficult decisions around reforming the way in which the criminal justice system works. Another thing which is significant, and I say it because it's new for these Labour ministers, because the last time that Labour was in power, police and crime commissioners didn't exist. And I think it's fair to say, I think they have yet to really find work through what they think their relationship with police and crime commissioners is going to be. I think with the Conservatives, it was fairly clear. They were like, local policing policy is for the PCC to determine. The Home Office will focus on counter-terrorism and serious and organised crime. With the Labour government, I don't think that is the case because they have a whole set of commitments which are about local policing, actually. It's about the stuff that goes on in local forces. So what is going to be the relationship between the centre and the local in relation to who is setting those priorities? That, I think, is as yet undetermined, but it's very, very clear that there will be more central direction. I say here the centre is weak and fragmented. And what I mean by that is the centre of policing is weak and fragmented. You'll remember that when the coalition government came in, they had a sort of, what they called a sort of bonfire of the quangos. Anything that looked like a quango was said to be bureaucratic and inefficient and needed to be sort of chucked out the window. And there went the National Police Improvement Agency, and all of the little bits of the National Police Improvement Agency were scattered around the system, such that the Home Office now holds the Police National Computer and PND, and such that the College of Policing was created to do bits of what the MPIA used to do, and what was then ACPO, which I think they had a reasonable case for saying ACPO was not sufficiently accountable. It was a private company. It was a very odd organisation in many ways, but it was quite strong and it was quite powerful, much more than the National Police Chiefs Council currently is, because I mean ACPO could employ people, it could sign contracts with people, all things that the NPCC cannot do, because it is a result of a collaboration agreement between chief constables. That is a very fragile basis on which to try to build national capabilities in policing. And I think Gavin Stevens was talking a bit about that this morning. And that, I think, is ripe for reform. The Home Office pulled out of policing policy, and it's come back in a bit. Theresa May, one senior civil servant put it to me the other day like this, that Theresa May didn't want to intervene in policing, so she got rid of the levers that the Home Office used to have for intervening in policing, and she didn't want to intervene in it. And Theresa May, I think, being the kind of politician she was very much, I've said I'm going to do this, and we're absolutely going to do this, and she did it. And then after 2016 and Boris Johnson and the successive prime ministers that followed, you ended up with Home Secretaries who actually did want to intervene in policing, but they didn't have the levers to do it because Theresa May had got rid of the levers. So I think that sort of sums up where they ended up at the end. And so they ended up with this very ad hoc thing where they were, I don't know if you heard about the national policing and crime measures which they brought in towards the end, where they started to inch towards a bit of a performance framework towards the end there, but it was very ad hoc. They didn't even publish the framework. It was all a bit odd. But the police, this is important for these Labour ministers because they've gone in there thinking, well, they know it's not going to be exactly as it was when they were last in office, but I think, frankly, they've been surprised by how different the Home Office is to what they left. And I think they've found a Home Office which has been gutted of its capability to set objectives for the system and to monitor the ability of the system to fulfil those objectives. A lot of that capability has gone, and I think one of their first tasks is to rebuild the capability of the Home Office to play a role in policing policy, which is, I think, what they want it to do. So, what have they committed to? The document which has been referred to throughout the day is the Safer Streets mission. This is one of the 5 missions which Keir Starmer set out for the Labour Party in opposition. And in relation to Safer Streets, I should say, I said they shouldn't call it the Safer Streets mission because, as you all know, crime doesn't even mainly take place on streets. It takes place in homes and on the internet. And actually only a minority of crime takes place on the street. But they liked the word Safer Streets, so here it is, Safer Streets mission. And there are 4 commitments in this. The first of which I think is very, very ambitious and stretching, and very important, and it's one that I completely agree with, which is to halve violence against women and girls over 10 years. So this is a 10-year mission to halve violence against women and girls. That is a very ambitious goal, given everything that we know about the underlying causes and drivers of violence against women and girls. It is going to entail a major, not just, and I should say this, doing that is not just or even mainly about policing. It is a wider cultural change in the way in which men and boys behave, think and act. And it is going to take, to achieve that is, I think, little short of a social revolution. That's what they've set out, I think, rightly to achieve, but it is a very stretching and ambitious goal. The second is to halve incidents of knife crime. The third is to raise confidence in every police force to its highest levels. And the fourth is to reverse the collapse in the proportion of crimes solved. There's an ambiguity in the word solved, which I think is deliberate. I think in the early discussions around this mission, there was something almost verging on reintroducing the old offences brought to justice target, which I and a number of other people pushed back on very strongly, because if you reintroduce essentially a target for detections and charges, you'll just incentivise everyone to go out arresting lots of young people for trivial and minor offences, because it will be the easiest way to meet an offences brought to justice target. They haven't done that. They've talked about resolving more crime, which could include might not include charging someone an offence, it might include diverting them from the criminal justice system. So there is latitude in that commitment to pursue alternatives other than charging. And as I've just said, they're going to have to do that to deal with the fact that there aren't enough prison places. They're simply going to have to find more alternatives to custody. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the things that they've actually committed to in detail. Now, the thing to say about this mission is this is a 10-year mission, and the things that they actually set out in the manifesto are actually, if you like, they describe them as first steps. And these are actually quite small, relatively small measures to sort of get things going. This isn't the way they're going to achieve the mission, right? Most of that is actually unsaid, right? So these are the first steps towards doing it. So they're talking about having specialist rape courts, specialist rape units, which do exist in some forces, but they're talking about having them everywhere. There were various things in there about tackling misogyny in schools and online, and establishing a domestic abuse register, which is about monitoring offenders. I'm going to do this quickly because there's quite a few of these. Knife crime, you'll have seen they published a knife crime plan last week, but the commitments they made around this are around making grooming and criminal exploitation of children illegal, mental health workers in schools, youth workers in A&E, tackling the sale of knives online. And one thing that isn't mentioned in the mission, but Diana Johnson mentioned it earlier, which I think is quite a very important thing, is a major prevention program for young people. And the thing they had committed to in the manifesto was prevention hubs. And they've been described to me as being like Sure Start for teenagers, essentially. I mean, this is where you have identified young people that you think are at risk of getting involved in violent crime, having a multi-agency supportive set of services in these hubs, which will work with those young people to prevent them getting involved in violent crime. So that's I think, a significant commitment. Raising confidence in policing. We've heard about the 13,000 laboured officers. I'm sure people have questions about that. Raising standards of conduct. They haven't talked about how that will be done, but I can imagine they'll go back to the police regulations. They'll go back to all of the issues that emerged after the convictions of Cousins and Carrick, looking essentially at how you can remove bad actors from within policing and what you can do to do that much more quickly. A new national standards framework. I think they will set a national performance framework for policing. Happy to talk about that, what might be contained in that, because I've been doing a bit of thinking about that, maybe in the questions. And then tackling ASB through diversion programs, respect orders, which are sort of a bit of a step back to the old ASBO, but not quite, and community payback boards, which is about getting the communities involved in setting community-based penalties. Reversing the collapse in the proportion of crimes solved. They're talking about employing more prosecutors, tackling bureaucracy in the charging process, more direct entry detectives, and strengthening the victims bill. But I imagine there'll be a lot more to come, and they're talking about a crime bill. They set out a crime bill in the King's Speech, so I'm sure there'll be stuff in there around that. Now, I want to now just sort of take a step back out of the weeds of the different commitments, which I think in a way are those are what they describe as first steps, and you cannot understand from what that stuff I think the full nature of what they will try and do. And the biggest thing which I think characterises what the government is trying to do, not just in relation to crime, but in relation to other areas of their missions, is this mission-led approach. So what is a mission-led approach and how is it different? And the first thing about a mission-led approach is, the person to read on this is Mariana Mazzucato, who's an economist who's written, this is her concept. She's the person who inspired this whole notion of mission-led approach. And the idea is to set long-term goals, right? So that's the first thing. These missions are setting out, so they're saying, well, halve violence against women and girls over 10 years. And the idea is that you set an ambitious, stretching goal. You don't say necessarily how you're going to achieve it at the outset, because you want to give people flexibility to work out what is the best way to achieve it and to innovate and so on in trying to achieve it. But you set out that long-term goal. And that, you'll note, that is very different from the old target regime, because the old target regime was about KPIs which you monitor every quarter, you know, and oh my God, burglary went up in the last quarter. What are we going to do about it? You know, it is trying to move away from that, which gets people focused on these very short-term fluctuations in the data and towards something much more longer term. Now, how that will fit with a national performance framework and what the detail of that will look like will be interesting to see. But the idea is that it's long term. The other thing about it is it's supposed to place an emphasis on prevention because it's not, and you know, halving violence against women and girls, halving incidents of knife crime, this stuff is, the police are going to play a role in that. But as I said, a lot of that is going to be about preventing these things from happening in the first place, which is going to involve work of local authorities, housing providers. It's going to be about the education system. It's going to be much wider than policing. So there's going to be an emphasis on prevention rather than cure. And the third element, I think, of a mission-led approach is that it's supposed to be whole system. So the idea is this is not just a mission for the Home Office. So these missions are held or sort of hosted from the Cabinet Office next to number 10, right? So these things are supposed to operate across government departments. So in the crime mission, I imagine it probably, there's going to be a Safer Streets board. I imagine it probably will be chaired by the Home Secretary, but all of the other cabinet ministers involved in that will be part of it as well. Because obviously if you're going to tackle violence against women and girls, for example, you need to think about what's happening in terms of social media online, what's happening in relation to schools and so on. And so all of the idea is this is whole system and you have to involve different government departments. So those are the things that I think make this mission-led approach distinctive. And it's the one thing that I think is the kind of common theme which we're going to see running throughout the way in which this government approaches public services. And there are also one thing that was quite silent in Labour's manifesto, and I think this is largely because the public probably won't be very interested in it. So, you know, in a manifesto, what you're trying to do is set out the things you think you want people to vote for. You know, this is some stuff we think you might want to vote for. But a lot of policy is not about, if you like, the so-called retail offer. A lot of policy is about how you run the system and what you're going to do that. And they didn't have that in their manifesto because, frankly, I don't think voters largely aren't very interested in how you do it. They're just interested in, are things going to get better? You know, we'd like to see less crime, more police on the streets. We don't really care how you work that out. Just deliver those things for us. So there are the Labour programme is quite silent on these issues of the underlying enablers of the things they're trying to achieve. And this stuff is being fleshed out as we speak. But I think we can say three things. The first is that the Home Office will be, I've talked about the Home Office being an active system steward, which is about the Home Office. The role of the Home Office should not be, as I think it was under the previous government, which was quite ad hoc, jumping from one thing to the next, doing lots of kind of micro programs like, Safer Streets Fund and GRIP funding and all this sort of, these kind of programs that are just kind of launched, and then the Home Office spends quite a lot of time monitoring how well people are implementing those programs. I think what the Home Office should be doing is it should be setting some long-term goals for the system, and then it should have a capability to monitor the extent to which the system is delivering on those long-term goals. That should be what the Home Office is doing. And I think broadly that is what they will seek to do. It will be a more active role for the Home Office. They absolutely think the Home Office should play a role in policing policy, which is very different from the Theresa May philosophy that I talked about earlier. Stronger HMIC FRS. So Andy Cook, before the election, called for more powers. He said he wanted more powers to require forces to act in certain areas, and they have said they will give HMIC FRS more powers, so we'll see a stronger inspectorate. And then the final piece of the puzzle, which hasn't been discussed in public really, but I think is kind of doing the rounds, and I've been one of the people sort of putting ideas into the mix on this, along with Tom, who I think you heard from this morning. This idea of I talked before about how the centre in policing is too weak. You have crudely put, you have lots of different organisations at the centre of policing at a national level, none of whom have any powers to really make anyone do anything. So, you have national portfolio leads, chief officers, 1 day a week, trying to persuade all their colleagues, 43 odd colleagues, to adopt common approaches, common standards in relation to particular problems. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked for years. It's like herding sheep. And I've been saying for a while we need a stronger centre to direct in areas where it's for the good of the country and for the good of the service. So I think the form that this may take, and this is still under discussion at the moment, is people have talked about national police headquarters, or trying to bring together all of those disparate bodies at the centre into a single national policing agency or organisation, which would be a host for some of the national operational capabilities. Been talking about public order and the need to have more coordination around that. NPOC is another operational capability. The helicopters, which no one wants to host, and which kind of get kicked around the system. No one wants the helicopters. Well, someone needs to host the helicopters, so let's create a national organisation to host the helicopters. And then also enabling capabilities, the most important of which is technology. It is a complete mess, the way in which the police service tries to deliver technology. Someone at the NPCC drew me on she didn't draw it, but she put it on a slide, all of the different national police technology programs that are currently in existence. And as you can imagine, this is a very complicated diagram. It's a really complicated diagram. What you really need across all of that is one single source of governance, one strategy to deliver what needs to be achieved in terms of digital data and technology in policing. And we do not have that at the moment. So I think candidate number one for putting in this national police headquarters is all of the technology stuff, police digital service. I'd take the technology, the big databases off the Home Office, which has managed them very badly, and put them back into policing. So I think that national police headquarters could provide the basis for doing all of that. And who knows, in the future, you might be even more ambitious, and you might bring, you might conclude that maybe the National Crime Agency should go into a single national body. You might conclude that counter-terrorism should go into a single national body. I'm not saying necessarily that's a good idea, but these are ideas that, I don't think for the next 5 years, but certainly later down the track, they're things that might be considered. And all of this, I think, will be packaged up in a white paper. So I think they will publish a white paper at some point, maybe before the end of the year, which will then set out a reform agenda around those key enablers, leading to legislation that will come forward. Now, my time thing is glowing red, so I shall try to conclude. Just some challenges which I think remain and which will be challenging. So the first is the state of the public finances. We all want more investment in policing, and we all want more investment in across all public services, I think. We've had 14 years of austerity. Public services are in a parlous state as a result of that, and the people who work in them are hard-pressed. But the fact is that the public finances are not in a great position, and they're going to have to take some surgery and some difficult decisions in order to deal with that in the budget next month. There's only sort of three ways of improving the public finances. One is that you cut spending. Well, I don't think they want to do that. They may do a bit of it in some areas, but I don't think they want to do that. The other is to raise taxes. but they promise not to raise taxes, not to raise most taxes, so the taxes which affect most people, which are income tax, national insurance and VAT. So that leaves relatively limited room for manoeuvre on tax, though I expect they will raise some taxes, particularly around pensions, investments, capital gains tax and some other things. But I think that limited room for manoeuvre on tax. So the only other way of dealing with the public finances is to grow the economy, is for the economy to grow, which so that the importance of that is absolutely critical. If we are going to get more money for policing, then this economy is going to have to start growing a lot faster than it's been in the last 20 years. And we shall see whether the government is able to achieve that. The second issue is around the persistence. So, I mean, I should say, this is a government that wants to spend more money, right? So I guess that's the difference. Right? This is a government that doesn't want to do austerity. It wants to spend more money. It knows it needs to spend more money. The question is, when can it get the money? And how quickly can it get the money flowing into the system? And another part of the context here is that just because of demographic change, all the money could be gobbled up by the NHS, right? I mean, we could just fund nothing else but the NHS because we live in an ageing society. So NHS, pensions, social care are just becoming an increasing component of public spending. I think the NHS was something like 30% of public spending 20 years ago. It's now approaching 50%, and I think it will. We could conceivably be living in a country where most public spending is spent on the National Health Service. So where does that leave other services in actually quite a difficult position relatively? So I don't anticipate there being, a land of milk and honey opening up in terms of public spending, unfortunately. Persistence of silos. They're talking about this cross-government approach, but working through departments is baked into Whitehall. It's how Whitehall works. So I think it remains to be seen whether this government will be successful in genuinely taking a cross-departmental approach, or whether those old departmental silos will reassert themselves. Events, it's very easy for governments to get knocked off track. I mean, obviously we saw the horrendous events over the summer, and I think that just demonstrates, particularly in the Home Office, it's very, Home Office ministers can get buffeted about by stuff. So if you're trying to set out a long-term strategy, you have to be very disciplined to stick to a long-term strategy, because politics is often just about, SHIT happens, and people expect government to respond to it. So events can easily knock you off course. I talked about national local balance, PCCs, etc. I think that is as yet to be determined. What is going to be how much of what you are asked to do is going to be set by the Home Office versus what is set by PCCs. More of it will be set by the Home Office than under the previous government. But how is that going to work in relation to PCCs? I think that is as yet undetermined. But I think you're going to see a more powerful Home Office and less powerful PCCs. I think that's basically what's going to happen. And then the crisis in the criminal justice system, which I think is just such a major challenge in terms of dealing. One of the commitments is around resolving more crime. Well, that is going to require quite substantive reform of the criminal justice system, and that will take time. And it's not easy, because as soon as you start reforming the criminal justice system, you have to make decisions which are not popular, like letting people out of prison, or not sending people to prison in the first place. Those things are not necessarily popular choices, but I think they're choices that are probably going to have to be made. So a challenging context, but on an optimistic note to close, I think the one thing that I think is in your favour and the system's favour out of all of this is that there is a government with a stable majority. It will last for 4 to 5 years. And as a result of that, I think you will get a clearer sense of direction for the system than we previously had when we had, 5 different prime ministers, God knows how many home secretaries and policing ministers. And there was a lot of what I started to call ad hocery, just things announced just to kind of, get through the next week. I think we've moved away from that just simply because of the parliamentary arithmetic means that they'll be in for a while and they'll be able to set a longer term strategy for the system. So at the very least, I think what you'll get out of that is some certainty. This is what we've been asked to deliver and we've got 4 to 5 years to get on with the job. Thank you very much.